evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. Apologies, I have a major technical problem with my camera, so you're going to have to put up with my disembodied voice. I'm having problems now with feedback actually in my ear, so I'm having real difficulties with my with my technical situation here in Derby. But anyway, we're discussing the housing emergency this evening. 40 years ago, the right to buy was introduced, and since that time, 2.6 million homes council homes that is, have been sold off. And today, over 100,000 families are living in temporary accommodation, while over 500,000 homes have no permanent resident. And to make matters worse, the wrong kind of housing that is being built across the country is unaffordable. And many people who are on average incomes, therefore, can't access it. They can't afford to rent. They can't afford to buy. And they're basically stuck, unable to get a mortgage and unable to afford the rent in the private rented sector. Much of that accommodation that is being built is being sold off plan and is ending up as Airbnbs or simply left empty, actually, for wealthy investors to accrue value and then sell it on subsequently. Furthermore, we're seeing council estates being demolished up and down the country for regeneration, but when they've been regenerated, very few of the properties which are put up in place of them are genuinely affordable. And so the council tenants are basically left in limbo and forced to move elsewhere. But, you know, instead of knocking down properties, the climate emergency demands refurbishment, not demolition, and bringing long-term empty homes back into use and retrofitting council houses would obviously help to tackle the climate crisis. But people are beginning to start to fight back, and on October the 9th, there is a number of street actions up and down the country to highlight these issues, and a national rallies plan for that day as well, calling for empty homes to be used by those living in temporary and overcrowded accommodation. Now, joining us this evening to discuss this issue is Will McMahon, who's the Director of Action on Empty Homes. Will, it's a major problem. How did we get to this situation, and what can we do about it?
It is a huge problem, and it's getting worse. I was just looking at a report that we put out 2 years ago, and there we were pointed to 86,000 families being in temporary accommodation, and now it's over 100,000. So it is growing year on year. And how did we get here? Well, that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that's happened to this country over the last 40 years is that we stopped thinking of houses as homes to live in, and we were educated into trying to think of them as assets. And I think if you look at television these days, there are lots and lots of programs which are about how you can improve your house, how you can improve your asset, how you can make more money out of it. And that's just the result of like 40 years of shifting in cultural thinking about what homes are for. And that was really kicked off, I think, by the right to buy. It was really kicked off by the notion that it was your property and it wasn't held in common. And what we've seen since then is that people have been educated to think, for example, that council houses are not places that you want to live in. Yeah. Whereas I grew up in a council house and it was great. And the people I lived next door to were great. And, you know, we had our troubles, but who doesn't? But we've been educated to think council housing is a bad thing. Private ownership is a good thing. But curious thing happened. And I'll finish on this point. The curious thing happened was that all those council houses that went right to buy have started to pop up in the rental sector and have been bought up by investors as rental. So the idea that everybody would become a homeowner was a myth and is a myth. And in fact, what's happened is there are fewer homeowners now than there were in the decade gone past, and we're entering a mass rental economy, much like we had in the Victorian period.
Sorry, Will, we've lost Chris. So I'm going to get Lizzie in, see if Lizzie can take over for a while. Take over, Lizzie.
That's okay.
Yeah, we love it. We love it when a plan comes together. We're the A team. Mhm. So if you talk about the council housing, for example, you were saying that there are less homeowners, there are less council properties. So where are people living?
They're living in very highly priced rental flats and houses. So it's basically you have a lease on the home where you live, which is called rent. And what's happening there is that this has developed an economy whereby developers can build stuff for rental. And you've seen like organizations like John Lewis and other corporates saying we're going to get into house building for rent. Yeah. So we've got a rental economy now. That's what's emerging. And if you're living in a rental economy with the rights that tenants have, then you're incredibly insecure. You're really, really insecure. So the other thing that's happened is that rents have got so high is that people are stuck because they can't actually accumulate the money to buy the notional house that they might like to own. So they're stuck in renting forever. So they end up at the end of their, working lives without any capital. And that's a massively serious problem.
Yes, it is a massively serious problem. I know that Germany, actually, most people, is it 90% of people in Germany rent? They don't own their houses at all. And is that, do they have rent limits, caps?
They do. They have rent caps, and they have really quite serious controls on what landlords can do. And that's why it works there, because they've got they've got a kind of a corporate European structure where rental isn't seen as a threat because the state operates to make sure your rent doesn't become too high and that your rights as a tenant are protected, and the landlords have a duty to make sure that your house, your flat, is looked after properly. So it's a whole different system. So they think of it very differently over there than we do. Now, there are attempts being made to break that system up. I mean, particularly in Germany, in Berlin, we've seen a lot of protests going on there about big investors coming in to try and take over blocks of flats, to try and monetize them for a profit stream in the way that we see here. But there's a lot of resistance to that, of resistance to it, because the culture doesn't accept it. But here, it's just kind of crept upon us over the last 20 to 30 years that we've ended up in this position where basically, you can't get a council house. They just can't get them. A huge long waiting list of 1 million. And you've got a position where your only option is to rent, and the rent is exorbitant in many places around the country. So, your average working person is in a bit of a fix. Let me put it like that. So I'll talk about Islington, where I know, because I'm involved in a campaign there. But you can say the same across many cities, actually. In Islington, you have to earn you have to earn huge amounts of money in order to be able to get a mortgage. The average wage in Islington is 35,000. You need 4 of those wages to be able to afford a mortgage for your average house in Islington. I mean, it's extraordinary what's happened. And so people are trapped. They're trapped, and they are trapped at the behest of building societies and banks who are getting money out of mortgages, and the rental economy, these big landlords in particular, who are soaking up their income. So the average working wage doesn't go very far.
And even if you look at the finances, it's a circular economy, but it's not benefiting many people. If you pay, you're working and you rent a house, the house rent is £900 a month. So you can only afford to pay £500 a month of that. So you approach universal credit, or whatever it's called, or tax credits, and they pay the remainder of the £400 a month extra. So the landlord, the person who owns that house, is getting £900, 400 of it from the state and 500 of it from the person renting. And so that is going into whatever they want to spend it on, or perhaps it's going into a tax haven abroad. Often they're living abroad.
What's happening is really interesting, because we've got a bifurcated housing economy. It's split into 2, basically. And you've got people who are asset rich, and over the last 10 years, they've become richer and richer and richer. And people who are asset poor, who are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And so this is where we're getting the growth of the phenomenon of Airbnb, of second homes, of what are known as desirable coastal and rural areas, where people are buying second homes and turning them into holiday flats, or calling them second homes, or calling them Airbnb. They're switching them around all the time. And what that's starting to do is to lock people out of local housing markets. So and it affects them. It affects everybody across the country. This isn't just a big city thing. It's really important. It's not a big city thing.
It's certainly not. I spoke to you on the People Before Profit event that in my village, I live in the middle of nowhere, in the glorious Cotswolds, and in my village, say there are 500 houses in my village, 250 of them are empty because they're assets belonging to somebody who's already got 4 other houses somewhere else. And nobody who was born here can afford to live here.
And there is another because it's like there's a pyramid of purchases, right at the top. You've got some of the international funds, global funds, who
Lloyds Bank are doing it now, aren't they, as well?
They are. That's exactly what's going on. And these international funds, they came in, they put something like 250 million on the table in London last year, and they didn't want to buy big posh flats, big Mayfair style. They wanted to buy the smaller ones because they see them as an income stream that is absolutely reliable.
Well, they are, and from the British state as well, from the taxpayers or Bank of England, depends who you think supplies our money.
Well, that's the Bank of England, of course.
Yes.
I'm back, by the way. I'm back. And my camera's working now as well. So,
that is a win-win.
I was just going to say, just on the issue of the public purse and the cost of housing and how it's kind of ballooned. I remember I was chair of housing in Derby back in the early 1990s, just after, should I say, the deregulation of the private rental sector had come in. And you'll no doubt remember, Will, when George Young was challenged in the House about how will people be able to afford these deregulated rents. And he said, well, if people can't afford to pay market rents, housing benefit will take the strain. Then if you fast forward about 20 years or so, and the housing benefit bill was around about 25 billion, I think it was, they then started saying, oh dear, well, we need to start restricting the amount of housing benefit that people can actually get. And, of course, what they did was to penalise the victims of a policy failure. Both governments actually are responsible for that. I remember having an argument in the Parliamentary Labour Party in 2010, 2011, when the welfare reform bill was going through, and Liam Bird came in and told us that we should abstain on the welfare reform bill and actually get behind the benefit cap. And I was saying, well, that's the last thing we should be doing. If we're serious about welfare reform, what we should be arguing for is a regulation of rents in the private rented sector and a massive council house building and acquisition program. And well, anyway, we know what happened, but there's clearly been a massive political failure, it seems to me. I don't know whether you would agree with that, on both parties to actually address the housing crisis that we're facing.
I think it's fair to say it's a cross-party disaster, actually, because at the point at which you would have hoped, if you have kind of social justice in your kind of sites, which we as a campaign do, we're a social justice organisation, you would have hoped that what 13 years of the new Labour government would have done would have been to build more council houses, not sell more than the Conservatives, and that's what happened. So
they actually built less council houses, I think, didn't they? Well, I mean, I checked.
Yes,
on
they
this
did.
and,
they did. They
built fewer council houses.
Fewer council houses, and they sold more through right to buy. Right. So it was an acceleration of what it accelerated the process, and also it was accelerated by the ALMO, the Arm's Length Management Organisation, and the devolution of local housing, council housing, and stock to registered social landlords. And
it's interesting. So you're not a fan of ALMOs then, because I mean, we in Derby, we did actually
embark upon an arm's length
Yeah.
management arrangement.
Yeah.
It's a wholly owned council company. I was
Yeah.
chair of the Major Cities Housing Group during the mid-1990s, and we were trying to find a way of being able to raise the necessary capital investment to improve the stock, etc. When New Labour came in, I was hoping that we'd see a renaissance in council housing, but it was the same regime as we've just said. And we therefore had to find ways, innovative ways of being able to raise the finance. Now, we went down the arms that we wouldn't go for the large-scale voluntary transfer. We went for the Elmo on the basis that it was a wholly owned council company, and that enabled us to access, tens of millions of pounds to bring the council housing stock up to a decent standard.
No, that's
now, I
true.
wouldn't have chosen that, but I mean, I'm just interested in what you're saying, that you're not a fan of Elmo's per se. So,
because
unpack that a bit more.
It was an understandable manoeuvre by local authorities to get their hands on much needed cash. There's no question about that. But also, then that was the opportunity was to taken to get it out of the system altogether by some authorities. And so if you'd stopped at Elmo and you said, okay, this allows us to access the funds, then you'd go, well, that's quite a neat manoeuvre actually. But for many authorities, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
And
no.
So there's a big problem there. And then you ended up with, people living in, I'm sure people watching this will have been watching the ITN news broadcasts on the housing crisis, right? Which are an amazing piece of broadcasting, I think, for a commercial news channel, really, going into people's houses and going, look, what's happening here? This is a disaster. Why isn't something done about it? And that's because a lot of RSLs, a lot of the big social landlords have floated off into, they'd be stock market quotable if they were private. And they've got people earning loads and loads of money running social housing who have very little relationship with the person who turns the key and goes into the flat that's got water coming down the light socket. So there's a big issue there that we have to think about in terms of what are RSLs about, and a lot of them came and grew in that kind of cross-party period when the housing was getting worse and worse, and nobody wanted to reach for a solution for it because there was money being made. We should be frank about that. There was money being made in this process by lots of different people who benefited from it.
Yeah, housing associations changed, didn't they? They were kind of a nice value added, I think, back in the day. And they were very, very often very niche, local. But then they became kind of, very much a national entity in that sense, and became very, very commercially oriented. I remember John Healey being very proud of himself. And to be fair to him, it's not a very low bar, though. He was the best housing minister under the new Labour government. But as I say, it is an incredibly low bar. You had to be pretty sort of crap to, if you were pretty crap, you would still be the best sort of housing minister. But he was pretty proud of himself for securing a sort of a renewed commitment to council housing in the fag end of the Gordon Brown era, and I think they were going to build something about 10 or 20,000 council houses, pretty small beer. But he was saying he had to fight sort of tooth and nail, it's sort of like he said, sweat and blood to even get that little commitment. But we need so much more than that. We need hundreds of thousands, and it's interesting, isn't it? I remember reading a historic sort of an old Tory manifesto from 1951 where Harold Macmillan, I think he was their housing spokesperson, was committing the Tories to building 300,000 homes a year. And I think they managed it.
Yes,
they actually built more council houses, although I think the quality of them left a lot to be desired. But but there was a consensus then, wasn't it? Can we get back to that consensus, do you think, or what do we do on that score?
I think it's going to be a challenge, but I think what we have to do is we have to build a kind of a national campaign that links people living in coastal areas who can't get housing with people in Tower Hamlets who can't get low-cost housing. And we have to say, look, we've all got a mutual interest here in devising a housing model that isn't just kind of given over to the developers to make lots of money out of. So what we have to do is we have to get people in different parts of the country to recognise their mutual interest. They might be feeling it differently in different ways, but actually, if we can build that movement and we can build people on the ground in local communities taking action, saying this is not good enough, then we start to get a national picture that can actually meet the challenge of what the journalists on ITN have done. It's kind of outrageous some of the conditions that people are living in. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, there is a, you know, it's kind of social harm on a grand scale on what's happening to people with housing, not just people who've got damp coming down the walls, or people, you know, who, you know, are thinking, I need a bigger flat. And there's tons of people living in overcrowding, but there are so many issues with housing where people are being socially harmed by it, that it must be possible to bring together those people under a common cause. Because, you know, I'm a big believer that, you know, actually politicians change their minds when they see people moving. Yeah, it doesn't come out of, you know, a politician doesn't get out of bed one morning going, oh, I must do this. It's if they can see stuff going on out there and they think, we've got to address this, otherwise we're in trouble. Right.
Yeah.
And you can see what's happened with, you know, the new planning bill and all this stuff. Right. They've obviously, the government has misjudged that massively. Yeah, because they suddenly realised that a lot of their own voters are incredibly unhappy with it, because they forgot about that. Right. So what we want is an equivalent of people who are on low incomes or median incomes who are saying, this is killing me. This, you know, that my rent's killing me. My housing conditions are killing me. You know, I can't, my children can't find anywhere to live. You know, the rent's phenomenal for them. And actually, you know, my child can't find somewhere to live. Yet down the road, I know there are 2 or 3 empty properties, right? So we need to work out a way. And that's part of what we're trying to do, of knitting this stuff together and saying, look, we are all on the same side here. It's the expression of a different problem, the same problem. It's the housing crisis. It's expressed differently, but we've got to work out how to get people to collaborate, because it would be a very, very powerful force. You know,
it was interesting, wasn't it? Just on the point. Oh, sorry, go on, Lizzie. If you was going to say something, go on.
Can you list the people that are involved with your action on the 19th of October, isn't it?
Yeah. So what we're trying to do, and we want to broaden it even further. You know, we want as many people who agree that there is, you know, we've got, basically what we're saying is there are 500,000 properties in the country without a permanent resident. We've got 100,000 people, families in temporary accommodation. They should be in those homes. Yeah. Why aren't they in those homes? Yeah, it's really simple. Yeah. You know, well, that's one of the things we're saying. And so we've got defend council housing, disabled people against cuts, because of course, if you're going to renovate houses, then you can make them accessible for people. That's what we should be doing. You know, there's Homes for All, the Labour homelessness campaign. We've got John Bird from The Big Issue, who made the most extraordinary speech at our first campaign rally in April. It was a remarkable speech, actually. We've got the Radical Housing Network, Renters' Rights London, Social Housing Action Campaign, Greater Manchester Housing Action, People Before Profit, Streets Kitchen, Street Storage, Yes to Fair Redevelopment, which is a really interesting campaign in Southwark. These people are saying, we're not against development, we just want it to be fair, actually, so local people get some of the development. And then we've got Unite Union London and South East, and we've got Unite Community London and Eastern Region, who have been fantastically helpful, actually, the community union. So we're building a coalition, and we want more people to get involved in that coalition in 2 ways. You know, we want them to get national organisations that have an interest in housing, and there are lots of them, to come onto the coalition. And then we want people on the ground to do stuff on the ground, so we can have a base and a national coalition that can have impact. You know, and if people are thinking, well, you know, what issues are you talking about? Well, let's just think about people who need housing. It's, you know, it's 500,000 people who are sofa surfing. It's the 100,000 families in temporary accommodation. Yeah. It's all the people who are homeless on the streets. It's all those, for example, people who are migrants and refugees who need accommodation. Yeah. Now, this country bears a responsibility for what's been going on in Afghanistan. Yeah. We have now got a refugee crisis that is phenomenal, right? People are in no position to say there are not enough houses to both house the homeless in this country and refugees. There are more than enough. Yeah. There are more than enough. So, you know, we want refugee and migrant organisations, safe places for women, victims of domestic violence. We need empty homes could be used for that. You know, there's a really, obviously, people coming out of the prison system who need somewhere to live, you know, which is safe for them, because that's what they need. You know, people who are, you know, have drug dependency problems, who need a safe place to be, you know, that's clean and tidy and that they can be encouraged to look after, you know, and get themselves back together. And all of these people have an interest in these 500,000 properties, in particular the 250,000 empty homes. So we think it's got huge potential, We're still working it. You know, you'll both of you will know when you're doing campaigning, you have to work at it to try and get it right, don't you? It doesn't, you know, just doesn't appear.
No, absolutely. And it's great that you're building this coalition, because that's crucial, it seems to me, to bring people together to maximise the impact, and to get civil society, pressure groups, trade unions, etc. Hopefully that will force the politicians to listen. But just on another issue, just in relation to the role of local authorities, now that the cap has been lifted on the housing revenue account, there's no impediment other than right to buy, of course. And, qualify for right to buy for 50, to start to qualify for 15 years after a new property has been built, as you'll know. But local authorities, it seems to me, are not stepping up to the plate in the way in which they should be doing, I don't think. I mean, what's your thoughts about what local authorities ought to be doing? Because not only could they be building, obviously subject to the availability of skilled tradespeople, and they would have to bring people in to train them up if need to be, but they could also buy, as used to happen, couldn't they, in the 1970s, the old municipalisation programme, just simply buy properties on the open market to address, if there was, if there was a shortage.
Yeah, some of them are thinking of doing that. Some of them are thinking of doing that.
At last. Well, I've been banging on about that for bloody years, so.
There are some authorities. I think Sunderland's one of them.
Well, that's great.
Who are thinking
are
of
you
doing
at liberty to say who? Are you at liberty to say who they are, Will, or is it sort of?
I think Sunderland are definitely doing something in that area, and a number are thinking about it, right? And I think we should need to encourage them to do that. We really do need to encourage them.
Well, definitely. I mean, and I think what would be great, I mean, back in the day, I was involved in the local government anti-poverty forum, and there were some great initiatives being undertaken by local authorities. And, sometimes an initiative would be adopted by one local authority, and then you'd have officers in other local authorities saying it was not possible. But then you were able to point to these other local authorities and say, well, hold on, well, they're doing it in Hull or in Newcastle or in Bristol or whatever. And so I think if we could get one or two local authorities to break cover and to sort of start making a genuine contribution, given that the shackles have been lifted now. I mean, we were calling for that for God knows how long, and now it's happened. So they should be, should be going forward.
Yes, there is an issue for some of them, is that they haven't got anything to raise capital on.
That's right. They've already sold
but surely the rental stream, though. Surely the rental stream covers. I mean, that's the beauty of housing. The rental stream will virtually cover your development costs. I mean, subject to being able to put the land in.
But they haven't got a rental stream left because they've given away all their housing portfolio.
Oh, I hear that, but I mean, but start again then. Why can't they just start again? There's nothing to stop them doing that, is there?
Well, because I think. Go on. Because I think that they've lost the skills and the inter-office skills, especially.
There is that.
The councils. It's a long time since the councils have been a responsible housing provider. In some cases,
that's true, Lizzie. But of course, back in the day, before council houses existed, nobody had those skills, did they? Back then, and they learned as they on the job.
No, you need to. No, I think there's two things going on here. One is, the councils can do it if they, if they want to put their minds to it. That's one thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is that because of the kind of huge cuts to local government over the last 10, 15 years, people, their skill sets have disappeared. I mean, the idea of a local authority having an architect's department. What?
Yeah.
And then you're fighting with a developer, and the lawyers are saying, look, we're fighting a developer here. It's going to cost us a fortune.
Yeah.
Let's just kind of
give in.
Let's just give in, because we can't spend that money on fighting that developer, and there are so many of them. But I think what we need is for a series of local authorities to kind of have a bit of ambition around housing. And say, actually, there is a different way that we can do it. I mean, we're talking, and I can't say who they are, but we're talking to a couple of local authorities who we're saying, look, you've got large numbers of empty homes in your local authority. You've got different communities who need housing. You've got, basically, you can get a local Keynesian effect by having a borough-wide campaign around getting housing, empty homes occupied. So you win on the temporary accommodation bills, you get people into decent housing. Local trades actually benefit. Yeah? But what you've got to do is you've got to make it an ambitious campaign where the empty homeowners, and they're not all kind of villains. Do you know what I mean? Some people just don't know what to do with their houses, you know, where you can get everybody and say, look, the empty homeowner will get a rental stream, get them in there. People will get local work. People will get housing, but it has to be led by the local authority in alliance with the community, because sometimes what happens when local authorities get involved with communities is they tend to take over a little bit. Yeah, but actually you do need the communities to do the work and to get engaged, because they can actually let you know about problem areas and what they might want to bring to the table in terms of revivifying the area they live in. You know,
that's
so
what we've been doing.
Is that what you've been doing?
Yeah, community building.
Right.
It's a huge thing. It's been going on for about 6 months now. And we've got all sorts of grants that you can get. At the moment, the grants are only available for planning, to help you with the costs of planning, to go through the planning committee, etc., which is very costly.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think it's replacing what the councils should be doing, isn't it?
Of course.
To a great extent, you know?
No, it is. It is replacing what the councils should be doing. There's no doubt about that. And I kind of have, you know, questions in my head about that, you know, about that, whether that's what should be happening, you know. And I think that really, because they find themselves in a bit of a bind, but I think they could at least talk a better game, and they could at least explore more avenues, and that's what we want them to do, because, you know, effectively they've been stitched by national policy, which says you have to build these many houses. If you don't build the houses, we're going to take responsibility of that off you. And they don't have the money to build the houses, and maybe they don't have any capital left.
Let developers build.
Yeah, they are, and so you end up with all these flats going up that nobody can afford.
No.
And that's
well, I just think there's a lack of ambition in local government. The days of municipal socialism is long gone, and I think you know, New Labour has got a lot to answer for, because it hollowed local government out. And it was tick box. There was this tick box mentality. Well, indeed, Thatcher before, but I mean, you know, Tony Blair was a continuation of Thatcher. She said that was her greatest achievement, Tony Blair and New Labour. And I just think we need to somehow recapture that spirit that we saw with local authorities like Lambeth, like Clay Cross, just up the road from me in Derbyshire. You know, with the Clay Cross rent rebels and so on. But and just in terms of the points that we were touching on. In my garbled introduction when I was getting terrible feedback, and so apologies again for all that. But this point about demolitions and local authorities now knocking down council estates and places of kind of, you know, regeneration and all that kind of nonsense. But it's interesting, isn't it, that I think it was earlier this year that the Royal British Institute of Architects came out in opposition, didn't they, to demolition.
Architects opposing demolition. Yeah, I mean, it's the impact on the climate is absolutely phenomenal.
That's right.
And this is where the councils, if the councils, you know, there's a space for them to move into, stop knocking down viable council estates. Stop doing it. You don't need to do it. And part of the problem of how they've got there is that councils were changed from organisations that were kind of servants of the community, that ended up seeing the people who lived in the area as customers.
Yes.
You know, and actually, if you want to,
revenue streams.
Yeah. So if you want to improve your revenue stream, to put it bluntly, you get rid of the poor people and you get other people in, right? And so you knock down council estates, and then you put up flash flats where you're going to get more council tax from them. And so, you know, and it's been a disaster actually. And so now that's a place where councils can say, okay, we're going to stop doing this. There is a climate emergency. Knocking down these council estates doesn't make sense. Retrofitting and refurbishing them does make sense. And it will actually it will help meet the climate challenge that we all want to meet. And it will also keep these kind of estates within kind of common ownership, if you like. And so it's a really obvious thing to do. It's a really sensible thing to do, because also you then save on your temporary accommodation bills, you know. So that's where they can really step up. And that's what they should be doing, in my view. That's what they should be doing. That's one of the things.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's a win-win situation, isn't it? That it seems to me, because you know you're tackling a social need. You know, you're bringing properties back into use, as well as, you know, I'd like to see councils building as well. But I think this the point that you're making about, action on empty homes. That is a major problem, and bringing them back into use is crucially important, and then making sure they're properly retrofitted and insulated, etc. That generates jobs, reasonably well-paid jobs, but also tackles fuel poverty, which is a major problem in this country, isn't it?
Exactly.
People unable, struggling to pay their fuel bills.
Exactly. There are houses, and some of the older houses across the country, who are deeply in need of a retrofit anyway, right? And it's quite hard to retrofit a house when somebody's living in it. But what you could do is you could start retrofitting all the second homes that could be retrofitted. Yeah. And that would be a really sensible thing to do, and it would give them longevity, and it would mean that you're meeting the climate challenge to that degree, and it would be a really, really obvious thing to do. The problem is that the mentality is now business mentality in terms of housing as asset rather than homes for communities to live in, and that's the big challenge. That's one of the things we've got to reverse. Now, local authorities can help do that. I think local authorities can help do it, but they can only help do it if they're working alongside communities who will work with them. The problem a lot of communities have is they felt they had things done to them rather than for them.
Yeah,
and they have.
They had quite a lot. Yeah.
But I think what I find so inspiring about what you're saying, though, Will, is how you've brought different groups, organisations together. Because then, as I was saying earlier on, people are, we're more powerful when we stand together. And I think one of the things that the resist movement that we're involved with, one of the things we're hoping to try and do is encourage people to recognise the power that's in their own hands, the power of solidarity, the power of standing together and forcing these so-called public service agencies to actually, do what they're supposed to be doing on behalf of the community. But unfortunately, it seems to me they listen more to the kind of corporate lobbyists, these powerful vested interests, and don't pay enough attention to the people that they're there, frankly, to serve. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
I mean, there is a gap. I think we know there is a gap between local authorities and communities at the moment, and it's expressed in lots of different ways. And it's really heavily expressed through housing, and that's amplified by the fact that national government has kind of got a grip on this, and the local authorities are kind of enables them to say, well, there's not a lot we can do about this, really. But that increases the gap between the local authority and the people on the ground. What you really need is local authorities aligning with communities to say, enough of this, enough of these kinds of developments. Right? We need I've stopped using the phrase affordable housing. Because in housing, everything is the opposite of what it means. Temporary accommodation is never temporary. Affordable housing is never affordable. You could go through all of these phrases. They need genuinely low cost housing for people on average incomes, and they could align with their own residents and their own communities in campaigning to do that. And that's one of the things we want to encourage them to do. So they're on the same side. But that implies an obligation on the local authorities to really listen to what people are saying, so that you don't wave through some planning application from a developer that's going to knock down 1,200 low-cost council houses and build 600 other houses that are going to bring in higher tax and more business in your mind. You've got to start listening to what local people want. That's crucial. But they will only listen if the community makes its voice heard on housing issues, and I think it's perfectly possible to do that. I think we can do that. We've just got to work out building that coalition and that alliance of organisations to demonstrate that it can be done.
Is that what you're doing on the 19th? Is that what you're asking people to do in their local actions, is to go along to their council offices and make a stand outside?
Well, what we're doing on the 9th of October is don't worry, is that we are asking people to make a point outside developments that are not producing affordable housing, but that are going to produce Airbnbs, buy-to-leave wealth investments and high rental properties. We want them to go outside those developments. We want them to go outside places where they know have been long-term empty properties that could be brought back into use for people to live in. And what we're asking is not a huge thing. We want a Photoshop of it could be 4 of you, it could be 40 of you, saying enough is enough. we've got to take action on empty homes, and we've got to stop building these developments which are creating emptiness. And we want to start getting a map together where we can get people doing this all around the country. So October the 9th is the start of it. And then we're going to roll forward from there into the new year and build local campaigns all around the country where people can express their upset and their anger and their desire to have somewhere that's affordable to live for them, that's genuinely low-cost housing. So it's going to be small actions across the country, and we're going to have a national rally where, you know, we'll be having a range of speakers at the national rally, people who sponsored the
Is that in
campaign.
London, in Islington?
It's good. Well, it looks like we're going to be going online on that. I'll be honest, because nobody knows what's going on with Delta today. So you're just kind of. So we're going to be doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to be broadcasting in street protests. We're going to be bringing them into the studio like this and getting them to say, "Why are you protesting?" So that people from Manchester and people from Tower Hamlets and people who live on the coast and people who live in the countryside, they can see the common interest that we all have.
So
that's
for
basically
me,
what it is.
So for me, an action for me as a person, I live in a very small village. If I went around the village and photographed each empty house and then put all those into a collage and said, look, there's 250 empty houses in this village. That's the sort of thing that I could do.
That would be fantastic.
If you live in a council estate, you know, how many of those houses are now, you know, you can look online, can't you? Another thing that Maureen Spinney said, if we could ask the local authorities what they're spending on B&B and housing benefits, can we ask that? Or does it mean that we have to ask for a
you can FOI it. You can. And it's an absolute fortune. And you should, basically, we can give you, in your local area, we can tell you how many second homes there are with no permanent resident, how many empty homes. Unfortunately, we can't tell you where they are because it's GDPR. But that's why it's down to community action, this stuff. How many
but your help as well. It just, you know, if I knew how many were empty in Stroud and how many were second homes, etc. I could 99.8% of people in my town and village would not have that information, would not have access to that information.
No, exactly. And I can tell you now that 1 in 40 houses in the Stroud district are empty. And I can tell you the figures have gone up by a lot. We have got all the data you need, borough by borough, and we can map it, right? So if people want to know how many empties, how many seconds, how many Airbnbs, we can let them know that. And that idea of a montage is a fantastic idea, right? People should take the initiative and express it in whatever way they want. One of the things that we're thinking of doing is putting QR codes on empty properties. So people can go up and read, because everybody's used to QR codes now. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we're all used to QR codes, and we're going to put QR codes on empty properties, and it's going to link to the national campaign saying this is part of the problem that we need to sort out. Join the national campaign. So
didn't the people of the road come up with that first?
They did.
I call them the people of the road. You know, they used to put a mark on the gatepost if you would give them a
of course.
Of course. I thought you meant the QR code. No, you're right. You're right. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that entirely. Yeah.
So that small start that you mentioned there, Will, is from small acorns, giant oak trees grow, which is one of our sort of mantras that we keep talking about. And in fact, the following weekend, which is on the screen, the 16th and 17th of October, we have the Festival of Resistance, where we will be bringing people together in Nottingham, hopefully, subject to COVID. And, the idea being to, get that sense of purpose by coming together and looking at how we can collaborate and take campaigns like you're talking about back out across the country, because there's so many issues that we do need to be challenging at the moment, because there's so much injustice in the country. But housing is should be a fundamental human right, and in the fifth biggest economy in the world, it's an absolute scandal of mammoth proportions that we've got people sleeping rough, people, as we mentioned in the opening remarks, 100,000 in temporary accommodation. It's just scandal. I mean, it just shouldn't be happening.
No,
and we've got to bring pressure to bear.
Yeah, we've got to
bring pressure to bear to stop it. Yeah, indeed. I mean, for sure. I mean, and So more power to your elbow. How long has your organisation been up and running for then, Will?
Well, we were formed in 1992, and we went through a number of ways of campaigning. And I was kind of brought in about 4 years ago, because I'm relatively new to the housing field. I've only been around for about 4 years, to give it a much more campaigning orientation, because people could see that was needed. So I've spent a lot of time trying to build links and working alongside other campaigns and organisations to get stuff going on the ground and to give it a national reflection. So we're kind of, when they talk about organisational development in its new phase, we're on the runway, and we want this to be part of our takeoff. That's basically it. But we want to do it in collaboration with other people. We're not into one organisation dominating everything, because it just won't. These days it doesn't work.
No.
No,
before
indeed.
we came on air, we were talking about the fact that Shelter, the charity that when I was a child would have been the charity that you went to, and they would have gone out and locally found you somewhere to live. They would have gone and grabbed the keys off of somebody and got you somewhere to live if you didn't have anywhere to live that night. And and then. Now, all these years later, I see pictures of a Shelter representative wearing a huge hooded fur coat in the cold, collecting signatures for standing orders and direct debits from people on the street. And in the corner of the photograph is a homeless person being arrested by a policeman. And you think that tells you everything that's wrong, with big organizations that have become corporate and are now just taking in money to pay their wage bill, I suppose, and not helping. Why didn't that representative, what I would have done if I was that Shelter representative, I would have taken my damn coat off and gone and given it to the homeless person, wouldn't you?
But I think what's happened is, and Shelter is interesting actually, because they now look like they are turning towards more campaigning activity, and I welcome that. I think that Shelter aren't unusual, and there are many charitable organisations who have kind of grown over the years, haven't they? And they've established their own bureaucracy, and then you've got to fund the bureaucracy, and then you find yourself in competition with other charities in the same field, and it's all gone a bit haywire.
And
I think.
And there's also a lot of restrictions as well, Will, isn't there? Government restrictions on what charities can do.
There are restrictions, and that doesn't help them either. But I think the charities that have weight, need to engage in campaigning on the ground. I think that would help. That would help an awful lot, and I think they can do it. And I think that Shelter are going around employing community organisers now, which I think that's a very positive thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very much so. That's where we should. Absolutely, that's the future. It seems to me that's where the action's at.
Yeah, that's good, and we should encourage that. We should, and we've had a lot of Shelter support for the stuff that we're doing. That doesn't mean I'm not uncritical of the organisation, but it just means that in our interactions with them, there seems to be they want to campaign and they want to get involved in issues more kind of on the ground, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a great thing, actually.
There's nothing wrong with being a critical friend.
No.
I have many critical friends, and I like them all.
Listen, we've got about 10 minutes before we have to close up shop. I just wondered if there's been any comments or questions from our viewers this evening.
I've been introducing them, perhaps not naming the people, but
I see. Right.
Sort of trying to introduce the subjects into the conversation, so it flowed. When you look at the councils, it's a similar thing there. If you go back 30 years, everybody who was a councillor on the council came from a council house. Everybody who worked at the council, whether they were tradespeople working, fixing up the houses, or whether they were in the office manning the desks, they were all people who lived in council houses. And all of a sudden, with the onset of houses are an asset, not a home, people now, if you go into your local council office, all of those people who work in there own their houses. So they have no idea what people are living in their council houses, if they've still got a housing portfolio, of course. And they have no idea what people are going through who live in letting agencies' addresses, you know, and they have no idea. They can't relate, can they?
I think you would find it very difficult to do that, and anybody would find it difficult to do that. And I think that's part of the point I was making about councils have become separated out from the local communities that they represent. And that's not to be, you know, I know councillors and I know some of them work really, really hard actually.
Yeah, some do.
And it's more about the organisational structure and the ethos, and that it's kind of, it's like a little spaceship over the community now rather than interrelating to it. And we've got to work out ways of addressing that. And actually one of the issues that came from local government reorganisation was cabinet. You know, when you introduce the cabinet office, you actually delayered authority and responsibility. You know, and you ended up in a very peculiar situation where a number of small people were making the decisions. A small number of people were making the decisions, and I think that was always meant by that. So, for example, if you look at the planning decision last night about Brick Lane and the investment, whether or not to accept the developer's money on Brick Lane, it was passed by 2 votes to 1.
Yeah.
No, indeed. I mean, that system. I think that system could be more effective though, because there are scrutiny committees. They can call in decisions. I think as you were, backbench councillors could be more proactive in their communities, be the elected community champions in that sense, and really kind of speak up for the communities. But unfortunately, far too many people end up becoming sort of embroiled in the sort of the town hall bubble, really, a bit like the Westminster bubble, and lose touch. So I think there are problems with that system, and systems, do make a difference. But I think, if there's will, where there's will, you can make them work. And I don't think we should allow councils to use that as an excuse or
I agree.
More detached in that sense. Because I mean, we can look back with rose-tinted spectacles at the committee system. I mean, that wasn't brilliant, but whatever system is going to be perfect. But
that's true. It's a good point. Yeah,
we had cabinet.
No, I do take your point though about that though. It has made it more remote in that sense.
I think so.
The backbench councillors need, and the scrutiny members on the scrutiny committee need to be flexing their muscles more, calling in decisions, saying this is not acceptable, and
they get
shining the light of scrutiny on what they're doing. Well, there is that as well, of course, and that's another systemic problem, isn't it? That system has led itself towards. But it could work. It could work, in a way where you are properly scrutinising, and
the
cabinet members are held accountable.
In 2009.
There's a lot of changes which were brought in, which have made things, more problematic and made
it gave the responsibility
institutions
to
less
councils to scrutinise.
They've taken a lot of that. I mean, of course, a lot of stuff's been put into the private sector, privatisation, initially compulsory competitive tendering, and under the best value, etc. And of course, we talked earlier on, I think you were talking about freedom of information, Will, at one point earlier on. And of course, public services which are sent out to the private sector are not subject to freedom of information, as far as I'm aware. So
no, they're not.
So that's another problem, isn't it? With the system.
There's development of a kind of a privatised, devolved democracy going on, which is cutting people off from the information that they need, and it's quite. I mean, I used to live in Barnet, and had the experience of that council, and totally unaccountable as far as I can tell. And the company that they handed it over to was totally unaccountable. And in terms of housing, it just means that it's almost it's really difficult for local people to get their hands on the lever of power and decision making in terms of housing. And that's one of the things that we've got to turn around. And even I'm involved in a campaign called the Community Plan for Holloway, which is about the redevelopment of the Holloway Women's Prison. And even with what I would say is a fairly progressive housing lead and a fairly progressive council on that question, it's still really hard for the local community to engage properly, because you've got Peabody, who are a big beast,
isn't it?
And you've got and you've got the Labour Council, and they're a big beast as well. And the thing is that working out how the community can get leverage on the decision making around housing is a really complicated thing, and we've got to start, and it's by being on the streets and making your voice heard is one part of it.
Yeah. Oh yes, I mean, I think that absolutely, and I think it's giving people confidence and empowering people to, as I was saying earlier on, recognise the strength of their own collective solidarity. Because in the end, particularly for local authorities, anyway, there is still some semblance of democracy, and these are voters, and you can exert your power in terms of lobbying and influencing in that way, and we've seen in certain circumstances where local groups spring up and they actually stand for election and replace some of these councillors that were not doing a sufficiently good job, as it were. But that's the key, it seems to me, to make these bodies accountable. And the best way, in my opinion, of doing that is empowering local communities. So it's great what you've been doing, Will, and fantastic that these street actions are taking place on the 9th of October, and this rally that is going to go ahead then, and hopefully that will be the start of something which will grow and grow. We've got, and we're just about out of time now, but I mean, we've got our Festival of Resistance that I've mentioned, and I'm hoping that we can encourage our members to collaborate and work together, because that way, I think, through collaboration, through working together, we can make a difference in the end, and we can bring about change and make these institutions work in the interests of the many, not the few, if I can coin a phrase. And we're seeing at the moment far too much power, far too much influence is being wielded by a very tiny proportion of society. And as the words of Percy Shelley, we need to remember that we are many and they are few. And it's just giving people that confidence, I think, isn't it, that they can make a difference, that they can actually, effect a change. But listen, Will and Lizzie, both of you, thank you. And once again, apologies for my difficulties I experienced. I'm not particularly great with technology at the best of times, and my camera wasn't working. Then as you know, my microphone packed up. And then I was kicked out of the broadcast. I managed to find my way back in somehow and got my camera working. I don't know how I managed to do it, but I did. But when you were first speaking, Will, I was just getting terrible feedback. I was hearing you, and then I was hearing you again. It was incredibly disconcerting. And then I went to ask a question, and then Gaz's disembodied voice came in and said, "We've lost Chris. Can you take over, Lizzie?" I hope that hasn't spoiled the enjoyment of our viewers too much this evening. I think, Will, you've been a brilliant guest. Thank you so much. I hope we can.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, perhaps you ought to come up
as well, that we can actually work together as an organisation and give support to what you're doing, and maybe as I say, collaborate with local groups in terms of some of these housing campaigns that you're engaged with, because as I said, if we can bring people together, then hopefully we can make more of a difference.
And make a montage of all the empty houses.
Fantastic, yeah.
Please do that, and let us see it as soon as, and then we can say, this is what's being done here. Why don't you do it where you are?
Exactly, that's the thing, isn't it? We can spread good practice.
Outside my council offices and say, look, join me outside the council offices.
That's a good note on which to end, I think. It's a good, that's a great one.
Absolutely. Listen, we're out of time now. Thank you very much indeed, again, Will, for that. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Tune in next week at the same time, 7 p.m. Hopefully, we won't have the technical difficulties that we encountered this evening, but hope you have a good evening. Thanks for watching, and good night.